All right, good morning, everyone. I hope you all have had a nice morning. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the working group discussion today. Before we get started, I just have a couple of reminders to go through. So the presentation that we'll be sharing today, along with the discussion paper, are both available out on the ISO website. You can get to that page by going to www.kiso.com. And then under the Stay Informed tab, you'll see Policy Initiatives. That'll take you out to our main initiative landing page. And then if you scroll down a bit on that page, you'll see GHG Coordination Working Groups. If you click on that hyperlink, the presentation and the discussion paper will be one of the very first activities listed there on that page. So as usual, the call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only. So any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These working groups are intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. And so we do want to hear from everyone, but just a reminder to please keep those comments and questions professional and respectful. And then we will be pausing for questions and comments throughout the working group today. So for those in person here at the ISO, you'll want to make sure to use those microphones on the tabletop so that our attendees on the phone line can hear you. If you connected to the WebEx audio, then you'll need to press the Call Me option or raise your hand using the raise hand icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you connected to audio separately outside of the WebEx, you'll need to press #2, and that will enter you into the question queue. So we'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the call today. And then you can also send your chat or your comment through the chat to all panelists. Elena is here in person with us today, and we'll be monitoring that as well. And just a notice to participants that we do have commissioners and advisors from state public utility commissions in attendance, and so just keep that in mind as we are going through the working group discussion today. So to kick things off, I just want to give a little bit of background of why we're here, why the GHG working group. So this working group was really formed to be responsive to stakeholder feedback that we received and continue those GHG design discussions, a lot of which took place during EDAM. And this process is ISO hosted, but it really is stakeholder driven. We really want to hear from stakeholders and make this as collaborative as possible. We also want to offer an opportunity for education on the current GHG design and also allow for discussion and analysis, new enhancements or approaches for both price-based and non-price-based policies, which would be reflected in the market. And so these first few slides here really go through process. So I'm going to go through the process slides and then pause to see if there are any questions. So the working group structure, we started off with a survey that we launched on June 16th, and then we received feedback from that survey on June 30th. And in July, we really focused on reflecting on those survey results and putting it together in a discussion paper. So that discussion paper was posted on August 3rd. And then that leads us to today, our first working group discussion here at the ISO. And so we have the discussion paper out there, which will help lead the discussion today. And it's also a resource for stakeholders to look back on as we move through this working group process. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. And so eventually, after the working group process continues, we will come up with a GHG action plan, which will inform a future policy initiative. So really, we like to think of this structure as pre-proposal development. So if we see the stakeholder process slide here, we typically have 3 stages, right? We have proposal development, decision, and implementation. So really think of this stage as the work before policy development. So a little bit more about the structure and the roles in the working group. So we have a facilitator, that's me. Again, my name is Isabella. So the facilitator is responsible for guiding discussion on the 3 Ps. So 3 principles, problem statements, and prioritization. So we really want to keep solution conversations focused for proposal development stage, right? So the work beforehand is focused on those 3 Ps, the principles, problem statements, and prioritization. The scribe is Jimmy Bishara. He's on the phone line with us today. And he'll be responsible for capturing discussion and the evolution of or proposals and publishing meeting summaries, which would be reflected in the discussion paper that will be an iterative paper that we'll post between working groups. And then also working jointly with me and the policy leads. And then working group participants, which is you all, your job is to provide ideas, proposals, and input and vetting. And these working groups are open to all stakeholders, and the ISO staff is going to be acting as a participant in these working groups. So the goals of the GHG coordination working groups. Again, we really want to hear stakeholder input on key components that lead up to proposal development. And so the #1 goal here is to develop principles. So define and illustrate the principles for market design. We do have I believe 6 principles that we have proposed and we'll discuss further today. But we want your feedback on those. And then also forming problem statements. So forming problem statements reflecting stakeholder concerns. So as you voice your concerns, really think about, what's the problem here? What's the meat of the problem here? And then #3, aligning on priorities and establishing meeting cadence. So we'll have some polling questions at the end of the working group today just to see, how frequently we should meet, how long the calls should be. We want your input on that. And then justifying problem statements. So we'll explore current ISO market operations, the functionality, processes meant to address problem statements, and then also if there's analysis or data needs that need to be done, we're going to discuss methodology for that. And then #5, determining action items. So providing a bridge between the working groups and proposal development. So what do we need to do in order to launch a formal proposal development stage? So some of these action items, we have some examples here listed on this slide. It might include steps to facilitate consensus and derive more value from an initiative. So for example, that could be an agreed upon methodology for monitoring and analysis post-EDAM implementation. It could be a commitment to a second phase of working groups to address some of the lower priority topics that we may not necessarily get to in this working group. And that's really just to make sure we're not straining stakeholder bandwidth. We want this to be feasible for everyone to participate and engage in. And then it could be a request for ISO staff to provide data analysis or assessments of operational feasibility. And then it also could be a proposal for third-party evaluation or coordination of topics which are deemed outside of the ISO's jurisdiction. So these are just some examples, and we'll form those action items as we go through the working groups. So a little bit more on the working group deliverables. You heard me talk about the discussion paper. So the discussion paper is published before each working group, and it really reflects the progress that we've made together working toward the working group goals. And the iterative process will provide an opportunity to reflect, comment, and prepare for the working groups. So again, these papers will be posted between the working groups and open for comment. And then towards the end of the working group structure, we will have the action plan, which will inform the stakeholder vision and roadmap for GHG coordination and that future policy initiative. Now, the action plan won't take the place of an issue paper, but it will help inform the issue paper and the straw proposal. All right, so the purpose of the discussion paper, it's a resource for stakeholders and working group participants to have a starting point for discussion. It's a good reference guide as we go through these discussions. It creates a record of decision making and really just allows stakeholders to reflect between these working groups. Now, the content in these discussion papers, instead of publishing working group summaries after each working group, we will revise the discussion paper and add any refined scope items. We'll add any requested ISO or subject matter input and analysis. So Jimmy will be capturing a lot of the requests that we received through these working groups and incorporating that into the discussion paper. And then in terms of the stakeholder involvement for the discussion paper, again, you will be able to comment on it between working groups, and that will be posted to the working group webpage, which is on that main policy initiatives landing page that I mentioned at the beginning of the call today. So the action plan, the purpose of the action plan will really serve as a bridge between the working groups and the straw proposal. So again, it doesn't replace the issue paper, it just helps inform the issue paper. And it prescribes a plan to address the identified stakeholder concerns. And so this will be written in coordination with the scribe, Jimmy, me, and then again, the policy leads. And then the content of the action plan will really recap all of the viewpoints that are discussed during the working groups. It'll identify any agreed upon problem statements and problem statement assessments. And it will prescribe action items to guide policy direction. They'll pursue supporting analysis and form the basis of that straw proposal. And then stakeholder involvement on the action plan, again, you'll be able to provide written comments on that plan and provide input into the process that way too. So I know that was a lot of information on the process itself. I want to pause here before we start talking about principles and just see if there are any questions, comments on the working group structure process. Do we have any hands on the phone?
There are no hands on WebEx.
Okay, all right. Well then let's, yeah, go ahead.
Hey everyone, this is Kevin Head. Just wondering, so the written comments are submitted through the ISO web page, is that right?
Yes, so we will publish a comment template on the working group webpage, and it'll stay open just like for how we do for the proposals and things like that. So.
Sorry if you said that already and I missed it.
No, no worries. Okay. All right, so let's get into the principles here. So these principles, it's important to keep in mind that these principles reflect standard principles of market design, and they should be kept in mind as we're going through this working group process. Now, not every topic that we discuss will align with each of the 6 principles listed here, but it does serve as a good resource to compare trade-offs of topics and problem statements. So as we go through here and you're thinking about, what problem we're trying to address, think about how it relates to these 6 principles. Is it really an efficiency problem at its core? Is it a simplicity problem, transparency, feasibility, and the list goes on. So keep that in mind as we're going through the principles today. So I'm going to start with efficiency, and then we will pause here just to get some feedback on this principle. So when we think of efficiency, we think of it relating to dispatch on offered prices that will minimize actual system production costs and assets that produce awarded amount. So my question to you is, do you have feedback on this principle? And in terms of GHG design, how do you think efficiency relates? And so I'll just pause here and open it up and see if we have any comments. I'm not seeing any hands on the WebEx, so I'll give it another minute. Let you think about it for a minute. We think about this topic of minimizing leakage. Would that fit under efficiency? Okay. Well, think about it as we go through, and we can always come back. So if we talk about simplicity, we think of this as just not overcomplicating the design, right? And one of the market design principles that we discussed in, the GHG design principles that we discussed through EDAM was seeking simple solutions where possible while balancing precision and implementation feasibility to support state policy objectives. So that also relates to this principle of simplicity. So same question to you. as you think about GHG coordination, how do you think the simplicity principle relates? Yeah, Sylvie.
Hi, this is Sylvia Fuak from the California ISO. When I think of simplicity, I think about a design that is broadly applicable and can accommodate as many market participants as possible, or something scalable. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Does anyone else want to respond to Sylvie or elaborate on that? Anyone on the phone? Okay. All right. Well, noted. We can move through to our third principle here of transparency. So when we think of transparency in terms of market design principles, we think of sufficient information existing in order to make bidding and procurement decisions, and also that market prices are transparent and known to participants. So again, when we think of transparency in terms of GHG, what else comes to mind? Do you feel like it's sufficiently captured here on this slide, or do you think we need to expand on this a little bit? You know, going back to those EDM design objectives, one thing that was in there was allowing for market efficiency by accurately reflecting relevant costs, including GHG compliance costs. So do you think accuracy kind of goes hand in hand with that transparency principle?
We have a hand from John Olson.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Good morning.
Okay, good.
Yes.
I think in addition to on the transparency part, the pricing, I feel pretty good about how that's going to be achieved on transparency, but I think carbon intensity, it can be reflective of price, but sometimes there's differences between price and carbon. So I would like to see some level of carbon intensity at some point to a measurement of how you participate in the market by hour. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think it is helpful.
Okay.
So it sounds like there's a data need there. And it looks like there was oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Can I just respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, this is Kevin Head from the California ISO. I'm in the market analysis group. So, you know, I think this topic is, this principle is important to me personally. I'm wondering, you know, thinking about carbon intensity, are we thinking about like an overall average system intensity, or would you like to see something more granular? What's kind of helpful? And then, you know, maybe we can talk about, do we want to see an average emissions rate versus a marginal emissions rate, and how that data could be useful in making bidding and procurement decisions. So that's what this principle speaks to me.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And then I saw a chat come in WebEx. Elena, do you have access to that?
Yeah, it was just a reminder to state your name and affiliation.
Okay. All right. Go
Oh,
ahead, Tanya.
there's one more hand from John Newton, EBCE.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, John. Is your line unmuted?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great, thanks. There was like 6 buttons. No worries. Thanks very much. This is John Newton with East Bay Community Energy. Responding to the conversation I was just listening to, something that we're thinking about in the broader GHG policy context is trying to educate and inform ourselves, but also our own stakeholders and other market participants about the carbon intensity of the grid and even the West at any given time generally, but also as part of this transparency principle, that there's a distinction between the resources and the emissions from resources that have already been procured and are being scheduled to serve, specific needs on a particular interval, and what else is out there in the market. So, kind of market transactions and the emissions and carbon intensity from what's available in the market versus what's already scheduled and accounted for. That distinction, I think, would be very helpful, both within the ISO, but within the broader WAC. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. Noted. Yeah, Kevin, go ahead.
Hey, sorry, I was informed that I was a little low in volume, so I just wanted to restate what I said. Apologies for that. This is Kevin Head from the California ISO. So, just thinking about transparency, two things that come to mind are we looking at the overall carbon intensity of like a particular area, or are we interested in the overall system carbon intensity? So just kind of the level of geographic granularity. And then two is, are we thinking about an average emissions rate over that area, or maybe we're interested in a marginal emissions rate? And, are we really concerned about, what that marginal generator or generators are emitting, or do we care more about what's sort of below that marginal unit and the total emissions arising from those? So those are the two things that came to my mind.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. And Anya, then Sylvie?
Sure, this is Anya Gilbert with the California ISO. Both a question and comment, so maybe a question back for John Newton in terms of just a little more specificity around kind of the carbon intensity reporting you're thinking of and how it might be different than what the CAISO posts today on today's outlook when it comes to the emissions intensity of the CAISO footprint. And maybe a comment for the transparency. I think just to follow up on some of the design discussions that happened in EDAM last year, I think there was a call for greater transparency about the attribution process, and then after the fact, kind of how the attribution process worked and what the results were. So maybe we can include that in the transparency principle as well.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Sylvie.
Sylvie from CAISO. I appreciated the way that John framed his comment on this, that it would be helpful to have more transparency in order to make those procurement decisions. And I think that that's what this principle is meant to illustrate. So I'd like to pose the question to the previous speaker, I forget who it was, that mentioned wanting emissions intensity data. And my question is, what value does that transparency have, or what problem does that solve for you? Do you need that extra transparency in order to make procurement decisions, in order to fill reporting and compliance? Just a little bit more specificity into the problem statement that this data is trying to solve.
Go ahead.
There's a comment from Ann Rendall, Washington U2C. There's a need for data for market participants in states for compliance and state programs. And then there's also a hand from Greg Miller, Singularity Energy, and then John Olson has his hand raised also.
Okay, let's go to John Olson so he can respond to Sylvie.
Good morning. Thanks. This is John Olson from SMUD. Yeah, a little more detail on that carbon intensity that I'm talking about. It does directly, I think in the future, I mean, right now, it may not be as important as we get to further and further along our.
Did we lose your audio, John? Looks like John's audio might have dropped.
Oh, I'm sorry, you there?
Oh.
Where did I drop off?
There you are.
I apologize.
There you go.
No, what I was saying
dropped
is that
off.
Okay, I'll pick up just when it drives procurement decisions, because as you start, having more ability to move load or make decisions on goals as far as carbon goes, knowing what hours or what's typical for a given hour or for a given condition, heat or such, it's going to drive your ability to make critical decisions of how to participate in the market. And so by knowing that generally, like what's the marginal heat rate? I mean, we kind of, from a thermal standpoint, we look at that today. Going forward, it would be really nice to know, okay, are we going to, so it seems to be a carbon-free market from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. All right, well, that's an easy decision to participate in the market. On other hours where it gets more intense, you might decide to move load around. So having that clarity and that transparency into what's happening, I don't know if we'll get to a spot where we can say proactively what's going to happen. I think that's going to be a very difficult thing to do. But I do think, to answer, to work off of the comments from the CAISO earlier in this thread was, is it a regional number? Is it a locational number? I mean, I think we could start with just a generic number, something that's probably easy to get across on the average. But the more specific we can get, maybe it's by zone, maybe it's by something a little more granular than just the market, that might be helpful.
Okay.
Does that
Yeah.
add enough
Yeah,
nuance to the question? Thanks.
That's very helpful, John. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, Jessica Zano, Puget Sound Energy. I just want to add that, there's kind of like what we need today and then where we're going and where we could see a market go and the benefits provided by this kind of information in the market. And I think utilities obviously have a compliance use for it, and I think there's a more broad application too when you look at, for example, renewable hydrogen development or industry that can benefit from making decisions, operational decisions on an hourly or a locational based granularity. So, there's the today problem and then there's the future problem, and we'd hope to build for the future problem as well. So thank you.
Yeah, that's valuable. Thank you. Go ahead, Yelena. Looks like we have some hands in the queue.
Okay, let's go to Greg.
Clarity Energy. On the question of carbon intensity and kind of responding to Kevin's question there, I think that the answer is that we need all of the above. I mean, on the average emissions side, we know that the carbon intensity of electricity that we consume varies by time and by location. So ideally, we'd want at least hourly data and ideally nodal carbon intensity that accounts for the power flows within CAISO and between CAISO and neighboring regions. And then on that type of data can be useful for end use carbon accounting and potentially also compliance with like SB 1158 for utility hourly reporting that will be coming up in the future in California. And then on the marginal side, I mean, marginal emissions can be a proxy for impact, but I think, as Kevin was alluding to, we need information about the total impact of that actions can take, and that could include both marginal and inframarginal resources. And, that can be useful for energy siting decisions, for mitigating the most emissions, for load shifting and other demand side decarbonization policies.
Okay, thank you. And Kevin or Sylvie, do you have any follow-up questions to that? Okay, great. Go to the next hand. Is there no other hands?
Yeah, let's go to Brian.
This is Brian Beering with Ellison Schneider. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Brian.
Great. So I'm with Ellison Schneider. We generally help entities with various GHG compliance obligations. So that's kind of my perspective here. I guess I'll follow up on Greg's last comment, because I think that was a great segue into this question about marginal, regional, what emission factors are coming out of the sort of the transparency portion of this initiative. And I think the MRR, the mandatory reporting regulation, is a big piece of that in CARB. And whether or not that emissions rate is changing in the upcoming rulemaking that they've signaled is likely to start later this year, that to me is like kind of the key question on, do we need that transparency? And if we do, what's the time frame for implementing this? I think that sort of makes us nervous when we're thinking about contracts that have been signed for like next year, for example, or even 2025, where we've sort of baked in GHG costs into those contracts. And then how does that sort of relate to the market designs that are being considered here? So I just wanted to add that additional detail on top of Greg's comment.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Go ahead, Anya.
So maybe just a follow-up, Brian. This is Anya with the CAISO. Really, it sounds like you're looking for transparency in CARB's process as far as what the emission factor they will select for unspecified sources. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. I think there's the question of the unspecified emissions rate that affects mandatory reporting regulation filings, and that in turn leads to a cap and trade compliance obligation. There's questions about, how does this work in EIM, and who's bearing emission costs from the EIM, and it really is mostly in the MRR that actually leads to a compliance obligation. But I'll sort of point back to some of the earlier speakers that pointed to other compliance obligations, like the Power Source Disclosure Program. So that doesn't lead to an actual emissions cost, but the CEC is looking at new rules in 2028 that will potentially, require a whole new different kind of accounting, new information sources flowing from suppliers to buyers, and there's a whole bunch of new compliance obligations all coming down the pike. And I think understanding the timing for those is really key, I think, from our perspective in terms of, again, structuring contracts, understanding compliance obligations that come out of various types of market behavior.
Thanks so much.
There's no other hands on WebEx.
Okay. Not seeing any other hands in the room either. So we will move on to our fourth principle here, which is feasibility. When we think of feasibility, we think of it relating to if it's operationally feasible. Can the market solve this within the prescribed timelines? Is it feasible from an implementation standpoint? And are there feasible timelines in general? So when we think about feasibility, what else do we think of in terms of GHG? Do you feel that this captures it sufficiently? Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
And I apologize, if you're giving it some more thought, it might fall into the efficiency bucket, but I think also avoiding out-of-market payments. So incorporating the cost of GHG sufficiently into the energy and GHG bid.
Okay.
No hands on WebEx.
Sylvie, did you have a response?
I think out-of-market payments probably falls under a lot of categories. I agree with efficiency, transparency also, because the more that the market is able to reflect all of these numbers and costs, the more transparent it is. So avoiding out-of-market payments would increase transparency. And probably also simplicity, because out-of-market payments are meant to correct for something that the actual market design doesn't necessarily accommodate. And then also a comment on your previous comment, Jessica. I think under feasibility, what we need to keep in mind are our short-term and long-term priorities. So if there are market changes that we need to make to accommodate, evolving state GHG designs, we need to determine what has to happen now to make sure participants can be active in the market, and what we can reprioritize for further down the line.
Thank you. Anya, did you want to add something?
Sure. I really like that principle or idea and potentially fitting it under efficiency. I think since each state is so differently situated and each kind of climate policy, if you could just speak a little bit more about the flavor of out-of-market payments you're referring to, I think that'll help us.
Yeah, so something that we've encountered in the Markets Plus discussions is the concept of a generator not being made whole due to nonlinear constraints in the market optimization. So just avoiding situations like that where, you know, that price is not visible to the market. Is that helpful?
That's helpful, just understanding the context. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good example of how these can touch on the various different principles, right? So we heard that it could address simplicity, it could address transparency, efficiency, and feasibility. So that's a good example of how interrelated the principles are here. Do we have any other suggestions or comments, excuse me, on the feasibility principle? Okay. And we'll keep moving through. Our fifth principle is non-discrimination. So when we think of non-discrimination, we think of no inappropriate or unacceptable GHG impact on a non-GHG regulation area or resource. And that might sound familiar from, again, the EDM design or the GHG design objectives that we developed through EDM. But what else do we think of when we think of non-discrimination as it relates to GHG? Sylvie?
All resources can compete on a level playing field.
Yeah.
There's a hand raised from Kathleen Colbert.
Yeah, go ahead, Kathleen.
I was basically, Kathleen Colbert from District, I was basically going to say what Sylvie just said, which is that all resources need to compete on a level playing field. I was going to give the example of that resources that have compliance costs, whether they are need to cover that compliance cost as a marginal emitting resource supporting that imports into a covered area, or those internal, should be valued at comparable level. So if the marginal emitting resource is a high emitting gas resource and the internal resource that would otherwise be dispatched is also this high emitting gas resource with the same emission rate, they should have the same compliance costs reflected in the pricing. And so the market should be insensitive to which of those get dispatched. But if the internal resource has a lower emission rate, then it should actually be it would be more economic to dispatch the internal resource than to support the dispatch of a resource outside of the internal covered area because it has a higher emission rate. So it's really important that there be that level playing field so that the market can actually produce reliable results that effectuate the environmental goals in an efficient way.
Thanks for expanding on that, Kathleen.
There is a comment from Anna Garza-Butz of SoCalGas. Under simplicity, can we expand the scope of how we determine the simplicity to look holistically beyond the CAISO and broaden to include simplicity to the electric sector and their compliance obligations under carbon regulations?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we can discuss more. Did you want to elaborate on that at all, or do we have any questions or comments from the group on that suggestion?
And there's a hand up from Todd Ryan.
Okay, let's go to Todd.
Hi, Todd Ryan, Pacific Gas and Electric. I think to expand on non-discriminatory, I would also add that participants within the GHG areas and the non-GHG areas should have equal access to residual supply.
Okay.
Okay, and we have a hand from Kathleen Colbert.
Okay, Kathleen.
Hi, no, thank you. I appreciate it. I had to miss the first part of the call, so this may be repeated, and I apologize if so, but I wanted to make a clarification on the efficiency principle for moving backwards, spirit of what Todd just did.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. I assume this was probably already brought up, but would just like to hear that confirmed that when we refer to minimizing the actual minimizing the solution or finding the optimal solution, I think, is a better way to frame that than to say to minimize actual system production costs, because the optimal solution should factor in the negative externalities associated with the environmental impact of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the total production cost of the solution may look like it's going up, but that's only because the negative externality has been priced in appropriately. So I highly recommend refining that principle to be to dispatch based on optimal, to dispatch on offered prices that will result in an optimal market solution.
Okay. Yeah, Sylvie.
Thanks, Kathleen. That was a really good point, and something I'd like to add is maybe just to extrapolate on this, minimize the cost of GHG policy, or the impact of GHG costs outside of the GHG regulation area. Might be an addition to this principle.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think it's adding another principle, but we want to produce efficient market signals that reflect both the need to meet the energy and ancillary service requirements that the market is optimizing, while the bids are allowed and or the greenhouse gas constraint represent the cost of compliance with an external environmental program. It's really an input to an efficient market outcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen.
Okay, and there's a hand from Laura Trelease of the Energy Authority.
Okay.
Hi, this is Laura Trelease from the Energy Authority. I have a comment on the non-discrimination principle.
Okay.
Something along the lines of not creating unreasonable hurdles or not prohibiting resources outside a GHG pricing state from being able to sell their output to states with a GHG pricing. So I'm not sure the best way to word it, but essentially to not have rules that create a prohibition from external resources being able to sell their output to GHG states.
Okay. Non-prohibitive.
Okay, and we have a hand from Callie Wells of Gridwell.
Yeah, Callie.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with the Western Power Trading Forum. I had similar comments along the lines of what Kathleen mentioned on efficiency. I just wanted to kind of add to that. So I completely agree that, part of efficiency should be creating efficient market prices. There's a whole price formation effort going on right now with that goal in mind. But I also wanted to, when we talk about the wording, I think we need to be very careful in what words we include in that principle, just because there's, I think in a couple of the other working groups, this idea of minimizing consumer surplus or, minimizing total production costs. I think we need to be careful about that because it really is, yes, it is a cost minimizing software, but it also needs to ensure that we have the efficient market prices coming out of it. So I just kind of wanted to echo Kathleen's comments and provide a little bit additional context there.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kelly. Do we have any other hands, any other comments on any of the principles? I know we're starting to think about them a little bit deeper, so if we need to go back, we definitely can. We have the time. Okay. Well, then our sixth and last proposed principle here focuses on jurisdictional roles and responsibilities. So when we think of this principle, we're thinking of it relating to the fact that market design should align with state greenhouse gas regulation policies to the extent practicable. So as we think about this principle, what else do you think it relates to? Any hands? No? Oh, we have one hand.
We have one hand from Anna.
Okay. Anna, can you hear us? Anna, if you're having audio issues, maybe you can put it in the chat, or we can come back to you. Are there any suggestions from others in the audience on this principle? Yeah, Kevin?
Yeah, hey everyone, Kevin Head from the California ISO. I guess I'd be interested in just hearing what folks think the ISO's role is in this area. So, I think it's pretty clear, we're the electricity market operator. We want to try to incorporate the GHG costs into the market, but, what other roles should the ISO take on, and which ones should we explicitly not take on? I don't know if that's going to be helpful in establishing the exact details of the principle, but it might be good for level setting for the broader group.
Yeah. Anyone have any responses to Kevin's question?
We have a hand raised from Brian.
Okay, go ahead, Brian.
Hi, it's Brian Baring with Ellison Schneider again. So I think that's a great question. When I heard that question, I thought back to some of the work that the ARB and the CAISO had when they were working through the EIM design, and in particular, the questions of secondary dispatch and how are GHG emissions assigned across regions. And it seemed to me that the ARB has statutory authority to run the MRR and implement the actual carbon cost on importers. But the CAISO plays a really important role in that in terms of providing information, providing analysis, providing data that goes into the mandatory reporting regulation and is used in the verification process, vetting that data, working with ODI to go through the tags and make sure that things are lining up and people understand what their reporting obligations are. So the CAISO does, in my opinion, have a very important role to play on that side. I think as I mentioned in my previous comment, the ARB is going to be working on a rulemaking this year. And as part of that, they signaled that they would be looking at emissions leakage. And they would be doing a study to analyze both emissions leakage from, sort of a historical look back at the EIM. And I think understanding that and how that's going to play into the rulemaking and how again, if there's going to be any change to the unspecified emissions rates, going back to the sort of the previous discussion around regional or zonal emissions rates, marginal emissions rates, providing that data, that analysis, and then having sort of enough, sort of runway before those things or those changes are actually implemented on the ARB side through regulation. I think that's how I envision the role of the CAISO.
Thanks for adding that context, Brian.
Okay, and Anna did put her question in the chat, wondering about the caveat to the extent practicable. Are we okay with misalignment?
Okay, so I'm going to look to Sylvie to elaborate on that.
Well, I think a lot of the speakers just now started to touch on these points. Both Kevin and the last point talked about, the fact that the role of the independent system operator is one thing and the role of regulators are another thing. So the market may not necessarily be able to reflect perfectly or accommodate all GHG salient policies. But we can do our best to, provide data for certain things, and other things might be able to be reflected in the market directly. So the question really is, I see the question less as, are we okay with misalignment, and more as, what is appropriate and what is not for the central market operator. Thanks for
for that, Sylvie.
Okay, and we have two hands, one from Greg Miller and then John Olson.
Okay, go ahead.
Greg Miller, Singularity Energy. So in response to Kevin's question about the kind of the appropriate role, I guess I would say that that role is changing. You know, traditionally, you know, I mean, the CAISO is not a emissions regulator or anything like that, but in the past, all of the data that we needed to help decarbonize the grid was done from a generator's perspective, and all of that data could be gotten from like the EIA or other sources. But increasingly, there's a recognition of the role that the transmission network and power flows and interchanges and everything else is playing in accurate and actionable GHG mitigation. And really the CAISO is the gatekeeper for that information and one of the only entities that might be able to provide it. And so its role in the transparency and enabling these decarbonization policies, recognizing the role of power system and market operations and the transmission network might necessitate kind of an evolving perspective on what the role the CAISO should be playing.
All right, I see Kevin nodding his head, so I think that was helpful.
Okay, can we go to John Olson?
Yep.
Good morning. I'm now going to sound repetitive because I agree strongly with what Brian and Greg just said. So the only thing I'll kind of add to that is that I think that the CAISO's got to harmonize with all the jurisdictional entities. And I guess we can talk about what the definition of harmonize is, but it really is that provider of information, whether that's power flows or data that's going to have to be needed to be able to do the reporting. And we get California centric, and I'm California centric because SMUD is in California, but the you know, with the other markets, if you're talking about extending this with EDAM and EIM and such, other entities are going to have those same kind of issues. So that same relationship that CAISO has to harmonize within California, it's got to harmonize across their entire footprint.
Yeah, Anya.
Hey there, this is Anya Gilbert with the California ISO. John, thanks for those comments. I'd love to hear a little bit more about you know, how you're thinking of just the phrase harmonize. I think from all three speakers that kind of responded to Kevin's question, I'm really hearing a response around CAISO as a data provider. But John, if you could elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by harmonize, that'd be helpful.
Don, are you still in queue?
So I thought I was going to get my get out of jail free card because I tried to make it generic enough that it could cover a broad area, because I do think it is about how you define harmonization. And I think that, you know, there's probably a lot of room to have that discussion. What I think about is the individual jurisdictions are going to have, I think Brian stated it really well, they're going to have their obligations to, for the MRR, all the different things that they need to be able to do. CAISO can't get in the way of that, but they also might have some of the data that is needed to be able to do the reporting on that. So it's really, when I say harmonize, it's really about being able to enable all jurisdictions to be able to do what those jurisdictions need to do, but then also be a player in that, in providing the data needed that is, and I mean, I'm loosely talking about data being pretty big here, but the data or the information needed to be able to account for all the jurisdictional reporting. Is that tight enough for you, or do we need to go deeper?
No, I think that's helpful and maybe a launch pad to kind of further discussion. You know, I'm really hearing feedback from this group that, you know, the role of the CAISO is around kind of providing data to support those state climate policies. I'm curious from the broader group that's on the phone and in the room if anyone else has other thoughts around the role of the CAISO. Thanks.
Yeah, Jessica.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica Zano, Puget Sound Energy. I think there's another role in the sense that in areas where you need clear policy direction, it's helpful to us as market participants to sort of have your support and your solicitation of the agencies as well for that policy direction. Otherwise, it ends up us kind of being in the middle, trying to trickle back a message. And so it's helpful to have advocates to, advocate for clear policy direction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a comment from Sybil Geiselman, PGP Public Generating Pool. PGP would also like to see coordination with the Washington Department of Ecology and its role implementing Washington's GHG program. And the cap and trade program, like CARB, Ecology is also engaging in a rule-making this year to address issues specific to the electricity markets.
Okay, so a follow-up to that, you say coordination. Can you expand a little bit on what type of coordination you're expecting from the ISO? You want to enter the verbal cue? Maybe it's a question we can come back to and discuss at a later time.
And then we have a hand from Stuart Kelly and then Doug Howell.
Okay, Stuart.
I don't necessarily believe that CAISO's role should simply be limited to reporting. I think there's, depending on certain GHG program designs, there may be a broader role for CAISO to play. That role TBD based on the design, but I certainly wouldn't restrict it simply to reporting. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Stuart.
Okay, and then Doug Howe.
Yeah, go ahead, Doug. Doug,
Can
are you
you hear me?
unmuted? There we go. Hi, Doug.
Okay. Yeah, it took a while, several buttons to push. I just want to make a remark. So first of all, I'm Doug Howe, and I'm here representing the PUC MOU group of 6 Western state commissions that have clean energy rules, and will, provide more flesh in the comments that we put in by August 30th. But I just did want to make a remark that some of these principles are going to be in direct conflict with each other. And I'm thinking particularly of the jurisdictional roles and responsibilities coming into conflict with non-discrimination. Several of the GHG programs that some of the clean energy states have undertaken are by design discriminatory with respect to different types of generation. And that's unavoidable in those laws. And so without going into any more detail, I just want to call that out and point out that there's going to have to be some flexibility in how these principles are addressed going forward. I don't think they can be considered absolute non-violable principles. There's just going to have to be common sense and perhaps consensus around how much wiggle room we have within these principles. That's it.
Yeah, I
Thanks.
think that's a good note, Doug, and it goes back to that, initial reminder at the beginning that, not all of these principles are going to be checked off as we go through topics. There will be some trade-offs too to analyze there. But Sylvie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Isabella. That was a succinct summary of what I was thinking, and I'll just add a little bit more onto that, that as we think through problems or problem statements that relate to these principles, we can think of those as trade-offs. I have this problem and it gets in the way of the transparency principle. I have this problem and it oversteps jurisdictional responsibilities. And I think that'll be helpful not only for framing what the problems are, but the trade-offs associated with eventual solutions. So I think that was really wise to bring up and a good reminder of why this exercise is important. Yeah.
Do we have any other hands in the queue? Any other questions in the room or comments? No? All right. Well, those were the principles. Oh, okay, go ahead, Anya.
Sorry to kind of chime in later here. just reflecting on our principles, I'm also curious from this group if we're missing any. I think one of kind of a common theme that came up with EDM GHG design was minimizing leakage. And I'm curious if the group feels like that needs to be its own principle or if it fits into one of the existing principles. Thanks. Oh, so I was asked in the room to repeat the question, but should minimize leakage be a principle, or does the idea of minimizing leakage fit under one of these existing principles?
Any initial reactions to that question? Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
She had to ask the toughest question of the day. I think, Jessica Zano, Puget Sound Energy. I think this is another one that Sylvie pointed out that could go into many of these categories. Efficiency, and I think there's a balance that has to be struck between minimizing leakage and cost to ratepayers, and that maybe has to be decided by each jurisdiction involved in some kind of a policy statement. But I think it potentially fits in many of these, and I maybe wouldn't have it be its own principle.
Okay.
Thank you.
And there's a comment from Anna Garza Buse of SoCal Gas saying, I support making minimized leakage its own principle. And then we have two hands, one from Doug Howe and one from Todd Ryan.
Okay, and Anna, if you want to elaborate on, the reasoning behind wanting to make minimized leakage its own principle, that would be valuable too. So if you want to raise your hand to discuss further, please do so. We could go to the next hand.
Okay, Doug Howe, go ahead.
Yeah, on that issue, I think personally we see it as falling under the no, inappropriate or unacceptable intrusion of these programs on the non-GHG zone, that it kind of fits within that context. But I do agree with the general comments that have been made that there has to be a trade-off between the cost of minimizing leakage and trying to make the perfect be the enemy of the good, in other words.
Yeah, thanks for that, Doug. Do you have any other comments?
The next hand is Todd Ryan, PGE.
Okay, go ahead, Todd.
Hi, Todd Ryan, Pacific Gas and Electric. I want to concur with the other commenters that minimize, I think, is too strong a word. We wouldn't want to do that if, say, the cost of the next reduction in leakage is 10x the cost of carbon. And so we're going to have to understand those trade-offs better to reasonably contain or modify the principle in such a way that we achieve the goals of the greenhouse gas programs without undue costs and burden. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and then we have a hand raised from Laura.
Okay, go ahead, Laura.
Or Trelise with the Energy Authority. I also agree that I don't think it should be its own principle. I really appreciated Todd Ryan's comments just now because I think striking that balance of cost versus leakage is really important. But I also feel like a lot of the conversation sometimes revolves around the theoretical reduction of leakage that may not be based in actual reduction in leakage, but yet still results in an increased cost to ratepayers. And I think that's something that we need to also be aware of, is how do we, if we propose something or move forward with something that's intended to reduce the possibility of leakage, that it actually does reduce leakage and not just theoretically do so at the expense of ratepayers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Laura. I saw a chat pop up.
The chat is from Milos Rustanovicio. We need a very strict definition of leakage. There are certain types of leakage the market cannot solve.
Okay. So a follow-up question to that, Milos, what do you think of when you think of leakage? And I'll open that up to anyone else too. What do you think of when you think of leakage? How should that be defined?
And we have a hand raised from Kathleen Colbert.
Okay, Kathleen?
Thank you. Thanks. I may answer a slightly different question than the one you just posed. I apologize. But this is Kathleen Colbert from Distra. I agree with a lot of what I'm hearing. I want to try to connect the dots, which is that, well, first off, minimizing to me doesn't mean erasing. So I think some people may be hearing minimize to mean a result that has no error, which is not true. Even in even with the CAISO's energy and AS market like core goal of minimizing production costs, we actually don't solve a perfectly optimal solution. There is a gap by which the market solves. So just for folks who are less familiar with optimization, it's never, even when we say minimize, we don't mean a zero-sum game. We mean within a reasonable range of the result should be reasonable within a range of trying to minimize that solution. But what I wanted to connect the dot on is that my comments on efficiency and really wanting to make sure when we talked about efficiency that we recognize that it's not minimizing total production costs, it's producing an efficient market outcome that incorporates the negative externality. If folks aren't connecting the dot, and that's what I'm hearing, the reason to do that is to minimize leakage. The reason that matters, the reason efficient market price signals that incorporate the negative externality are so important is because that's how the market will minimize leakage. And it's not going to result in 100% minimize. I recognize that. And like some of the other comments about you could define it differently. Well, the way that I define it is that we want to make sure that the market prices the compliance cost appropriately, does not suppress it, so that the market solution appropriately factors in the cost of meeting the core goal of the market, serving energy, while also factoring in the compliance costs associated with the cap and trade program. That will ensure that we're not dispatching resources that actually are what I consider leakage, which is if the net import value is being suppressed and it looks like the compliance is lower, but we're actually dispatching higher emitting resources, there's resource shuffling occurring there. There's some carbon shuffling, right? And so that's what we're trying to fix with the efficiency goal. So I think the comments about this may not be jurisdictional, this may be related to something else is really insightful. I think we need to connect the dot to the market functionality and needing to send the right price signals is the method of meeting these goals and making sure that we achieve what the market can achieve to administer the environmental programs.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. Go ahead, Sylvie.
Thank you, Kathleen. Sylvie from CAISO. I like the idea of connecting the dots, and one of the things that I'd really like to do in a future working group is to discuss how certain market design functions connect to certain types or certain concepts of leakage. And I'd also really like the group to think about what kinds of leakage exist. When I think leakage, I think of it as an economic concept. As Todd had said, it's the marginal trade-off between reducing emissions and reducing cost. But there's also resource shuffling and secondary dispatch and all sorts of perspectives and regulatory definitions. So it'd be helpful if the group could think about how those are categorized and how they're potentially treated in the market.
And there's a comment.
Before we move on, can I just make an ask?
Yeah, please do.
So in our board letter, that we submitted for the extended day ahead market, where we highlighted our concerns with the greenhouse gas functionality in the Western energy imbalance market. We've asked for a bunch of data transparency to be provided. That ask is still very much alive in our head. And it's been a while since we've made that ask. And I believe that there was some level of commitment. I can go look at the recording if that's the needed level. But I believe that there was some commitment to provide that data transparency. Specific metrics were asked for in the appendix of the letter. Can you please provide that data in one of the next meetings? In this process.
Hey, Kathleen, I think the idea behind the working groups is to be able to put that on the table and discuss with stakeholders what kind of data is useful and relevant, and what the constraints are on the ISO side in providing that data. I know I've heard a lot of comments about granularity, what's necessary for regulators. So I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of what data should be provided and can be provided. And I'd really like that to be an open stakeholder conversation.
Can we have that conversation next? Because I think the data is the core foundational aspect of this.
Yeah, and I think, later on in this discussion, we're going to pose how we want to utilize the next working group. And so maybe that's a good time to bring up, data transparency requests and other items for discussion.
A little bit earlier, Miloš Rustanovicio said leakage is a symptom of secondary dispatch. That is, GHG emissions are not accounted for. And then we have a hand raised from Brian Beering.
Okay. Brian?
Thanks. I was going to circle back on the question about what is leakage. And when I think about it, I think of it in terms of compliance obligations at the state level. There is a state statute that basically directs the Air Resources Board to minimize leakage. And I think in the past, we've always thought of it in terms of emissions leakage. So, market design principles here encourage greater emissions elsewhere. And that is a really tough issue. It led to a lot of painstaking discussions early on in the cap and trade regulation. There's a whole section in there about resource shuffling and all these different safe harbors to try to essentially provide enough flexibility so you can have efficient market transactions under the cap and trade, in the context of the cap and trade, and not violate that resource shuffling prohibition. And I point back to that, I think, because it's an important question to raise. The leakage question is an important question to raise in the jurisdictional role. There's not just a state statute, but there's a program out there, the cap and trade, that's being updated. And I think when I think of emissions leakage, I think this issue of, understanding it and understanding the points that Kathleen was making in terms of what does this mean in market optimization, and then translating that and how, you're the expert for your markets. You're the expert in terms of how this is all working. And I think you're in the best position to translate what we're saying in these working groups to CARB in the context of this upcoming rulemaking, to make sure that any changes that come through, really reflect the market design principles that you want to see for your market and what is the most optimum runs of the market. So hope that helps in terms of context of, where this has fallen in terms of regulatory definitions in the past.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. That is good context for us. Do we have any other hands raised, any comments in the chat?
Oh, we just got a hand from Todd Jones.
Okay, go ahead, Todd.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Thanks, sorry. So I just sort of have a question for the group. When I was thinking about leakage and this suggestion for a new principle, I started thinking that leakage is sort of relative to an individual state's policy or accounting rules, and that I wonder if this principle could be more broadly envisioned as comprehensive regional emissions accounting that does not double count. So that leakage of emissions with respect to any individual state's policy or emissions attribution can be measured and located, right? And then the state's policy can address that leakage if deemed necessary and determined to be cost effective. So in terms of where that might fit among the 6 principles, or if it's a new one, I wonder if it may be a new sort of accuracy of attribution principle. In that respect, now that wholesale markets are doing resource-specific attribution to state or zonal load in the market, I wonder if there's a need for a new principle about the accuracy of attribution, which could involve things like no double counting of generation or emissions, not harming existing market instruments and tracking systems, maintaining exclusive resource-specific retail claims. But I agree with some of the other comments made earlier about, that those things potentially also fit under transparency and non-discrimination and jurisdictional roles principles. But a question for the group, I just wonder if this specific conversation around leakage could be more broadly sort of viewed as this idea of comprehensive regional emissions accounting that does not double count, so that any leakage with respect to a state's policy can at least be measured and located, and then the state can respond.
Okay, so I'm hearing maybe the potential of an accuracy principle. Sylvie, I see you wanting to make a comment.
Yeah, I was just fervently nodding my head. I think that comment really beautifully captures what we've heard from a lot of stakeholders, and what we're sort of hoping, the direction we're sort of hoping to go in, which is there is one concept, which is counting and tracking emissions, and then there's another concept, which is how does the market reflect and deal with the leakage associated with state policies. And those are delicately different, but we're hoping to explore both of those ideas throughout these working groups, either in the form of, reviewing current GHG design and how that addresses leakage, or going through various metrics to determine how to count emissions generally.
And we have a hand raised from Claire Brednick.
Okay, go ahead, Claire.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, terrific. Sorry about that. This is Claire Breitnich from the Western Power Trading Forum. I don't want to belabor this conversation. I guess my starting point would be there is no set definition of emissions leakage anywhere that I'm aware of. I think
Oh, Claire, did we lose your audio? Is Claire still in queue, Yelena? Claire, looks like your audio dropped, so if you want to put your comment in the chat, we can come back to it. Kevin, I saw you start to raise your hand earlier. Did you still want to make a comment?
It would take us a little off direction, so I can hold it for a little bit.
Okay. All right. Anything else before we move on to topics?
Okay, we have a hand raised from Laura Trulli.
Okay, Laura.
Hi, Laura Trulli with the Energy Authority. So I know this is not really providing a definition of leakage, and I think Claire was starting to say that it sounds like there's not a set definition for emissions leakage. But I think that one of the things I struggle with in this discussion about emissions leakage is at what point is there an overreach of jurisdiction in telling someone outside the state how they can and can't sell their resources into a state with a GHG policy. So for example, if there's an entity that has a gas plant, a wind plant, and a hydro plant, what authority does a state like California or Washington have to tell that entity that you have to use your gas resource to serve your own load you have to use your clean resources to serve your own load first, and only if you have excess above that, then you sell your gas plant to Washington or California. So in other words, like mandating they have to serve their own load with their non-emitting resources first. Some of the proposals that have been floated around suggest that kind of mandate on how utilities would need to serve their own load. And it's just unclear to me at what point that's overreach of jurisdiction versus that sort of falls under this category of minimizing leakage versus actually targeting minimizing leakage.
Yeah, thanks for that context. That's good to keep in mind. Any other comments? Okay. Then we are going to move forward off of principles, but let's still keep those in mind as we go through the initial topics that we're looking at discussing. So these topics reflect the stakeholder feedback that we received in the survey that we sent out on June 16th. And so we took those results and put them in 4 pretty broad buckets. And these 4 buckets are the review of CAISO market operations and GHG design. So that could be an initial level setting working group to provide a benchmark for comparison and assessment. And another topic could be, creating transparency and facilitating deeper stakeholder engagement. And then the second bucket that we heard from stakeholders was this idea of state coordination. So clarifying the appropriate role of the ISO, which we heard a little bit about today, but we could expand on that in a future working group, just to really set guardrails around the discussion, and then also discuss regional coordination a bit deeper as well. And the third topic that we heard a lot of feedback on was beyond GHG price-based policies. So really considering all of the non-price-based policies like absolute emissions reduction programs or even load-based programs. So doing a deeper dive into those items there. And then this 4th bucket was emissions tracking and accounting. So again, maybe we need to have a level setting workshop or a working group where we can discuss the emissions related data that the ISO can provide. So I know that there was a lot of conversation about data requests, and so maybe that falls under that topic category. We could inform, these discussions could inform analysis on secondary dispatch and leakage, which has been a hot topic today, and also acknowledging the role of contract accounting. So these are just, broadly what we heard through the stakeholder survey. But I wanted to open it up here and see if there are any other topics or subtopics that you feel should be prioritized as a discussion point for these working groups moving forward. Sylvie?
Now, Sylvie from CAISO. I'll note that a lot of what we've heard over the past hour can fit into one of these categories, and it would be great if stakeholders could identify or add some details to those things. For instance, we heard Laura just now talk about the jurisdictional trade-off when it comes to the counterfactual approach. So it'd be great to hear, some comments under that first box, review of CAISO market operations, on what stakeholders are looking to explore in the current design.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. It would also be good to hear views on prioritization. So which of these topics do you feel is most important to talk about first?
We have a hand raised from Jeffrey Nelson, SCE.
Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
Hi again. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Hi, Jeff.
Okay, great. Good morning. I missed the beginning of the call, so I apologize if this has been asked and answered. But we raised in our comments the importance of market efficiency. The optimization needs to understand what the actual cost delivered to load is for power. For instance, if in California, if we get something from coal, if we're responsible for that, we have to go retire the allowances associated with the coal. If we get something from hydro, in theory, we don't. So if the optimization can't rationalize what it's really going to cost to load at the end of the day, the optimization can't find the right answer. So I'm not sure which bucket this fits in. I think it's in the upper left quadrant, review of operations and GHG design. A focus on ensuring market efficiency should be priority number one, maybe beyond legal compliant.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, Sylvie?
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more? Are you referring to the attribution process that takes into account the GHG costs of resources and investigating whether or not that solution is truly optimal or what the issues may be? Or are you talking about other mechanisms for identifying what resources are serving load?
We have a hand from Callie Ward as well.
Hi, there you go. They just unmuted me. Yeah, sorry, I was muted. I was really talking about the core design. Is your design, sort of, I'm going to be California centric because I understand California. Is your design, your market, your optimization really reflecting what it's going to cost me to take that power? And it's going to be tricky if people have different sort of GHG designs, but the optimization needs to ask that question. What's it really going to cost the load that is receiving this power? What's the all-in cost of taking that power? And if it doesn't understand the all-in cost, it is going to dispatch the wrong resources and actually provide bad answers to customers. So I hope that addressed your question. I'm not going to mute myself this time in case there's a follow-up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think that I'm hearing that as a question of how does market optimization take GHG costs into account? How does that translate to price signals? And what information do we have to determine how that played out? I think we can definitely explore those within that first category.
Yeah, and so to the extent the load has a compliance obligation, the optimization really needs to ask, what is it going to cost load if I take this power? And to the extent the generator has the obligation, the generator needs to be able to reflect what it's really going to cost it to sell you the power.
Oh, that's a good question. Thanks for that clarity on what the difference between load and source-based accounting might look like.
Yeah, and again, and it may depend on the actual compliance regimes that you're dealing with. So I don't have one crisp answer, but those questions need to be asked every single time. Is the optimization accurately understanding what it will cost to serve load if it's that generation is being taken? And as a generator, is the optimization accurately paying me what I need to recover my costs and whatever else I'm trying to recover?
Yeah. Hey, Jeff, this is Anya with the CAISO. Sorry, I heard just a little bit of back and forth there around either source-based or generation-based compliance. And I'm maybe just to kind of clarify your point, are you really asking about kind of understanding of the current market, or is this more of consideration as we look at other designs in terms of how those costs are reflected in the market and the impact to load?
I think you can ask it in both contexts and sort of see how good the current design's doing. I mean, but at that bottom, if you're not truly reflecting what it's going to cost people to produce or what it's going to cost people to buy, you're going to have a suboptimal result. You're not going to do the right thing, and there's going to be hidden costs that are going to make your result the wrong answer. So ask it in the current design and ask those same questions in any new designs that we start talking about.
Okay, great, thank you.
Do we have any other hands in the queue?
There's a hand from Callie Wells.
Okay, Callie?
Hi, it's Callie Wells with Western Power Trading Forum. I actually have a very, very basic question, so I apologize if I missed this clarification at some point in time during this call. So when we're talking about identifying issues and starting to define problem statements with the design, so a lot of those questions that Jeff just asked, I'm assuming, and I'm hoping you can confirm, that we're talking about the design as currently proposed for EDAM. And assuming that that's the accurate assumption there, at some point in time, we are going to need to do analysis to start to quantify or even evaluate if these issues or problem statements are materializing and to what extent and what other issues are there, so that we can compare the current issues with any future issue, or the current design with any future design. So maybe this is more of a process statement or a question, so I apologize for asking it now that I'm thinking out loud on this one. So has the CAISO thought about how they're going to do that within this effort? Because obviously EDAM won't be implemented for quite some time, so are we going to talk about problem statements and issues and then wait for some data analysis to support that? Or is this just kind of preemptively starting to think through issues that kind of arose through EDAM, and then we'll, again, kind of wait for some data?
Hey, Kelly, this is Anya with the CAISO. Maybe just kind of taking a step back, I think one of the first statements I heard you make is kind of a question around, is this just focused on existing EDAM design? And I'd say no, it's more expansive in terms of it would look at the existing EDAM design, but also kind of take a broader approach to look at either alternatives, enhancements, or approaches for, say, an area that doesn't put a price on carbon. So maybe that's just kind of point one, is it's not just the EDAM design. And then to your second point on, how are we going to do some evaluation without EDAM being live? I think one way I can see that happening is, one, this group can kind of help develop problem statements and the issues that need to be looked into. But I think one of the roles of the GHG action plan at the end can be to have a process and forum to do the data analysis once EDAM goes live, to evaluate and come up with metrics for what is evaluated with GHG EDAM go live. Those are just some initial thoughts, but I welcome feedback on that as well.
Okay, I really appreciate that. That was really helpful. I was struggling a little bit with how we were going to kind of get to an end result without EDAM going live anytime soon. And in my mind, that involves making trade-off decisions between what is implemented for each GHG design versus other alternatives or enhancements. So if this is just ending in kind of that action plan, and then we'll kind of sit on that for a while until we do get some experience, that makes sense. So I really appreciate that clarification. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly.
There's no other questions in queue.
Okay. Any other comments from the room? Okay. Well, I think at this point we are going to do some polling questions. So for those of you in person here, if you want to go to www.slido.com and enter the passcode that's up on the whiteboard, as well as the password. That will give you access to the poll. You can also participate in the poll if you are in the WebEx right now. It should pop up on your screen. But Silas, I think let's go ahead and launch the first Slido question. It should pop up in the right-hand side of your screen right by the chat window. So this first question, of the 4 presented topic areas that we discussed, and if the topics that came up today during the principal discussion fall under one of these buckets, what should be prioritized as the first for discussion? If you want to take a minute and submit your response in this poll, we'll keep it open for a little bit. I'm just going to select other so that don't skew responses, and we can see the responses here in the room. So right off the bat, I'm seeing the majority wanting to discuss the review of CAISO market operations and GHG design. And then following that topic, it's looking like emissions tracking and accounting. I'll leave it open for a bit longer. Looks like we have 40 who have submitted responses. Yeah, so review of CAISO market operations and GHG design and emissions tracking and accounting look like the front runners here, followed by state coordination, and then other, and beyond GHG price-based policies. So a question before we move on to the next poll here is, if you selected other, what is a topic that you'd be interested in discussing? And if we aren't prepared to raise it here, you can always submit it in your comments. Do we have any hands in queue, Yelena? Okay.
No hands in queue at this time.
Okay. All right, so then let's close out this polling question and move to the next one. And this next question focuses on what we want to discuss at the next GHG working group meeting. So, Kathleen, I heard your request for data, a discussion around data. So, as we look at these options listed here, if it doesn't fall under an informational workshop on the ISO market operations and GHG design, or an informational workshop on emissions tracking and accounting, maybe it's a continued discussion on principles or problem statements, or if it doesn't fall into one of those categories, you can go ahead and select other. And I'll ask that same question again. If you select other, how would you like to utilize that time on the 13th? So again, I'm going to select other. Okay. So it's looking like we want a bit of level setting here on the ISO market operations, GHG design, and the emissions tracking and accounting, which is aligns with the response to the previous polling question. Looks like the priority for the level setting discussion, so focuses on emissions tracking and accounting. And following those level setting discussions, we're looking at beginning discussion on problem statements. Okay. So if anyone selected other, do you want to raise your hand and share how you'd like the time to be utilized on the 13th? And again, if you're not prepared to share right now, you can put it in comments. Any hands, Yelena?
There's currently no hands raised, but I can't see the chat.
Okay, we can come back to the chat. Okay, so then let's close out of this polling question and move on to the next set of questions, which really focus on balancing staff and stakeholder bandwidth, and focus on the cadence of working groups and the duration of working groups. So our first question here is, how frequently should the GHG coordination working group meet? Is it once a month? Is it once every 3 weeks? Once every other week? A different frequency? Go ahead and take a minute and submit your responses there.
Isabella, the comment was if the next meeting was September 13th or 14th. PowerPoint shows the 14th and Slido showing the 13th. So
yeah, 13th? I think it's the 13th. That's just a typo. We'll correct that. Okay, so initial responses showing once a month for the frequency of working groups. We'll give it another minute here. It looks like we have 39 responses. It looks like the majority is once a month with almost 70%. Okay, let's go ahead and close out this question and move to the next. So in terms of format for these working groups, what's the preference of in-person versus virtual? And I'll select in-person or hybrid, just so we can see the results here. Okay, so I'm seeing a large majority say virtual. Looks like 34 or 33% looking at in-person or hybrid. Okay. This is good feedback. Thank you. Okay, let's move to the next polling question. It looks like 70% prefer virtual. So in terms of length of time for a working group, is 2 hours sufficient? Yes, no? If you put no, what is the sufficient length of time from your perspective? And you can put that in the chat, or you can raise your hand and share what you prefer. Okay, so 97% thinking yes, 2 hours is sufficient. Okay. That is by far the majority, so I think we can move to our last polling question. All right, this last question. Should the ISO explore alternative mediums for information sharing? So I know those initial topics that we want to discuss are those level setting conversations about emissions tracking and accounting and the review of CAISO market operations and GHG design. So do you prefer the format of that to be an interactive working group? Do you prefer a pre-recorded webinar, models? How do you want that information shared? And if you want the information shared through that alternative medium, what medium are you thinking? And I'll select yes. Okay. Yeah, so we're seeing a good majority say yes, look into alternative methods. Is there a preference from the group on which method? Anyone want to raise their hand and elaborate?
Kathleen Colbert has her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Kathleen.
Hey, thanks, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Yeah, I think that you have a lot of ways to help provide some of that information folks were asking for. And a few of them are on my mind, but I was just starting to look at the training modules. I know that there's some areas of the training modules that cover GHG, but I don't recall which ones. That can be circulated broadly. The conversations that occurred at the Greenhouse Gas Working Group under EDAM, which included a lot of the background information that I saw folks kind of responding in the poll to, are recorded. If you could provide the links to the ones that provide the overviews of the CAISO's functionality, the training for, I know you're going to be working on training for EDAM that's going to explain the changes to that, if there are any, provide that once it's available from the training department. There's a lot that's already out there. I would highly suggest we not use time repeating content here and just send the recordings or the links to folks who want to brush up on the foundations.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. We'll definitely take that down as an action item.
There's a comment from Todd Ryan from PG&E to leverage existing trainings and pre-reads where possible. And then from Sydney Welter of Western Resource Advocates. Says models are always helpful on educational items. I think it makes sense to be mindful of how we use our 2 hours per month and share your own time materials where it makes sense.
Yeah, this is good feedback. Thank you. So it sounds like there's consensus on trying to utilize existing resources out there. So we will make a note of that. Any other hands? Okay. All right, then we can close out the polling questions. That was all for polling. And then we can move on to some next steps here. So in the survey, we did receive feedback from about 14 organizations that noted interest in presenting at a future working group. And so some of these stakeholder proposed topics from the survey focused on state rules and regulatory requirements, stakeholder experience with multi-regional compliance, and challenges associated with absolute emission reduction policies. So again, these are just some of the topics that were proposed. But if you do have an interest in presenting at a future working group, please let us know. You can send an email to isostakeholderaffairs@caiso.com. And in the email, just make sure to in the subject line, say request to present GHG coordination working group, your proposed topic, and then your requested presentation time. And we will coordinate with you to get you set up to present at the appropriate working group discussion. And then, again, on this slide, this is a typo, but the next working group meeting is September 13th. So we'll make sure that's accurately reflected. And then, again, the comment template is available out on the GHG Coordination Working Group webpage, and it will stay open until August 30th, that deadline. So please be sure to submit your comments, not only on the discussion paper that was published on August 3rd, but also the working group discussion that we had here today. We really want to hear your feedback. And then this last slide here is just a couple reference links. So we have a link out to the GHG Coordination Working Group page, and then my email and the ISO Stakeholder Affairs email as well, if you have any questions. So before we conclude today, are there any last questions, comments, items we want to revisit before we conclude?
No comments or hands on WebEx.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate the discussion today and look forward to continuing this working group series. Thank you to those who made the trek out to Folsom to participate in person and to our virtual attendees. And we'll work on putting out a revised discussion paper for everyone to review and reflect upon before our next working group. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
That will conclude today's conference. Thank you for using Event Services, and you may now disconnect.